We're thankful for the storm. We hate for them to pass over these days, but we enjoyed the rain. Hopefully enjoyed some of that hail. We're going to sing this song till the storm passes by. We're talking about the storms of life. Brother Jim, whenever you're ready, and see. In the dark of the midnight have I oft hid my face, while the storms howl above me, and there's no hiding place. Mid the crash of the thunder, precious Lord, hear my cry. Keep me safe till the storm passes by. Till the storm passes over, till the thunder sounds no more, till the clouds roll forever from the sky. Hold me fast and let me stand in the hollow of thy hand. Keep me safe till the storm passes by. Many times Satan whispered, there is no use to try.
For there's no end of sorrow,
There's no hope by and by. But I know thou art with me, and tomorrow I'll arise, where the storms never darken the sky. Till the storm passes over, till the thunder sounds no more, till the clouds roll forever from the sky. Hold me fast, let me stand in the hollow of thy hand. Keep me safe till the storm passes by. When the long night has ended and the storms come no more, let me stand in thy presence on that bright, peaceful shore, in the land where the tempest never comes. Lord, may I dwell with thee till the storm passes by. Till the storm passes over, till the thunder sounds no more, till the clouds roll forever from the sky. Hold me fast, let me stand in the hollow of thy hand. Keep me safe till the storm passes by. Amen. That's a great song and a good start. You can be seated this evening as we sing our last song, Christ in Me.
Christ in me is all I wanna be. Solely you in everything I do. Cleanse me today and mold me like the potter's clay. I'm free to be Christ in me. Christ in me is all I want to be. Solely you in everything I do. Cleanse me today and mold me like the potter's clay. I'm free to be. I'm free to be. I'm free to be Christ in me.
Amen. Well, that seems like a little bit of a short song service tonight, but I was wondering if there's anybody that had a request that we might be able to whip out for you tonight. Anybody have a favorite song? Tori? Okay. Let me know when you know, okay? Anybody else? Yes? As the Deer? Okay, I think we might be able to do that one. Do You got that one, Beverly? We probably know that pretty good. As the deer pants for the water.
These will help us so that we can live a life. And I know there's people here that don't seem to think that it's not worth it. You know, I come to church, I faithfully serve, but no one seems to notice me. Well, God does, because God thought it was important enough to put people in the Bible that are unnamed. You know, there's people every single week that most probably people don't know who they are that come and clean this church. You know, every week. I'm glad that they do that because it keeps our church clean. There's people that run the sound system. There's people that make the bulletins for us, that design the slides. Most people don't even think of it. They're just, oh, that's a cool slide. You know, it's interesting. The only time someone notices, if someone didn't do the slide is if it's a mess up. You know, that's just what we do. It's not on purpose. It's just what happens. But God knows who you are. And, we try to be appreciative. But I believe God puts these people in the Bible that necessarily aren't named, but it's for a reason. I want to take a look at the first two, and what do these unnamed people in the Bible do? What's significant about it? Well, number one, they prayed. We know that they prayed. And I want to look at Luke chapter 18 and verse 10, and I'll slow down because I know the last time I was reading through the things, the people in the back couldn't keep up as I was switching through verses. But Luke chapter 18 and verse 10, and we're going to talk about the Pharisee and the publican. And I want to extrapolate and maybe make a parallel between how one man prayed and another man prayed, and how maybe one man lived his life and how another man lived his life. I can hear some pages turning. I'll wait a couple more seconds and while I turn there. Luke chapter 18 and verse 10, it says this. Luke 18:10. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this man is. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. I think it's interesting. We have number one, they prayed. Well, letter A is the Pharisee, and letter B is the publican. We see two different. Now, we don't know anything about these men's lives. But I'd like to suppose for a second, I think I know how the Pharisee lived. I think I could tell you how the publican lived. I think the Pharisee was trying to get his name written as hard as he could in somebody's book, written somewhere so that he'd be remembered forever. The publican was just trying to pray to God. I'm sure the Pharisee went up there and was like, hallowed be thy name, O Father. Was probably prayed this prayer so everybody could see it. Told people like, if I have, when somebody gives me 10 horses, I give one to God. I get 10 pounds of gold, I give a pound to God. He's saying, I give tithes of everything I've got. I fast twice a week. That's how good I am. Well, I don't know about you, but when I was in college, I fasted twice a week or sometimes more just because I forgot to eat when I was doing it. I don't know. But he's trying to tell people, I'm so great. He probably was a smart, intelligent, learned man. And he says, I'm glad I'm not like this guy. I'm glad I don't, I'm not an adulterer. I'm not a sinner. And I find it interesting. He's casting condemnation on a man he doesn't even know. He has no idea who this publican is. This man that when he comes and he kneels down, I believe, and he doesn't even lift up his eyes, he's going like this, like, God, I'm not even worthy to be in your presence. I'm not even worthy to ask you for forgiveness or ask you for a blessing or to ask you for anything. I think the difference we can see is that the Pharisee was looking for the world to hear his prayer, and the publican was actually trying to get God to hear his prayer. And I believe as we live our lives, we should live our lives, even though we don't really know who these guys are, what age they were, how old, that we should live our lives like the publican, to come into God's presence, where God doesn't have to humble us, He can exalt us. In Proverbs, if I remember correctly, I don't remember the exact verse, but it says, now don't sit at the front of the table, sit at the back. Because if you sit at the front, they might kick you to the back, and then you're going to be embarrassed. But if you sit at the back, they might bring you to the front. And I find it interesting that I believe the Pharisee, he was trying to get his name in the history book. He was trying to be known. He was trying to get himself exalted. And guess what? He's a footnote in the Bible. It just says the Pharisee. It doesn't give how old he was. It doesn't tell you anything. It's just the Pharisee. So we know they prayed. Well, what else do unnamed people do in the Bible? Well, number 2, they sacrificed. They sacrificed. They sacrificed. You know, everybody knows what the Titanic is, right? Except for maybe some of the youngest kids. You know, 1912, it set sail from London, England. The engineer and the captain said, even God couldn't sink this ship. I don't know if God sank the ship, but I find it interesting, maybe ironic, that on its maiden voyage, it sunk. I don't know. But there was a 25-year-old senior wireless operator. Now, it's not talking about a wireless phone. It was telegraph. That's old tech. But it tragically sank in the North Atlantic following a collision with an iceberg on April 14th, 1912. And now, you know, the reason I'm telling you the story of Jack Phillips is because I didn't know who he was until a couple days ago. I know who the Titanic was. Everybody seems to know what the Titanic is. They've made dozens of movies. Interesting enough, they made a movie like 2 months after it happened to capitalize off the tragedy. But I didn't know who in the world Jack Phillips was. He and another junior wireless operator were responsible for all communications between the ship and other ships to relay information about where icebergs were, ships were. You know, and they relayed them to the captain, Edward J. Smith. As soon as Captain Smith and the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, realized the ship would sink in a matter of hours, both Phillips and Bride worked tirelessly, sending SOS Morse code message to any and all nearby ocean liners. As the ship started to make its descent into the North Atlantic Ocean, Captain Smith declared every man for himself. While Bride worked with the other passengers and crew to throw chairs into the water, life jackets, and get people out the ship, Jack Phillips remained at his post to communicate with other ships until the very last moment, which resulted in him tragically losing his life aboard the ill-fated liner. Without his tireless work and heroic actions, the RMS Carpathia, another ocean liner, would have never saved the 705 people and crew in the lifeboats and water. You know, I didn't know who this guy is, but I'm sure there's a few thousand people alive in the world right now that are glad that they saved him. Could have been their dad, grandfather, great-grandfather. And interesting enough, I was thinking about this. I know who my great-granddad is. I met him once. Actually, I never met him once. I met his wife. But I don't know who their grandparents were. But I'm very thankful that they sacrificed and gave and did stuff for me, because I wouldn't be here if they hadn't. But let's look at a couple people who sacrificed for Jesus, or sacrificed to help do something for God. Well, here's a popular story. Let's turn to John chapter 6. John chapter 6. If you're familiar with this one, this is the story of the lad, his 2 loaves and 3 fishes. I knew I got that wrong. I was saying 5 loaves earlier. Oops. It's 2 loaves and 3 fishes. Let's make sure that one's correct. But there's 2 loaves and 3 fishes. Well, in John chapter 6, it says this. Let's go to verse 1 to get some context. And then after these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Just for context, Sea of Galilee and the Sea of Tiberias, same exact thing. Have you ever heard of the Lake of Galilee? Same place, they just called it by different names. And the great multitude followed him because they saw his miracles, which he did on them that were diseased. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples, and the Passover feast of the Jews was nigh. And when Jesus lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, he saith unto Philip, Whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? And he said this to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, saith unto him, There is a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. I was right. It was 5 loaves. Never mind. 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. But what are they among so many? And Jesus said, Make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. Now we know the rest of the story. Jesus takes the loaves, prays over them, breaks them, and guess what? Those 5 loaves and 2 fishes fed every single person. You know, people say there could have been upwards of 20,000 people. Well, even if there wasn't 20,000 people, feeding 5,000 people from 5 loaves and 2 fishes is still a miracle in my book. But I just think it's interesting that this boy, we don't know how old he was. He's a lad, so I'm going to say he's maybe a teenager, maybe younger. But the disciples came to Jesus and said, hey, you've got food, we need it. You know, maybe that was his food for his entire day. Maybe the rest of the week, we don't know. But he gave without any, I'm losing the word, hesitation. Thank you. He gave without hesitation. He didn't hold it back. He didn't say, oh, Jesus, you can have 3.5 loaves, or Jesus, you can have half of my fish. And I'm sure Jesus would have probably been able to do a miracle with no fish or no loaves. But this little lad, that was his everything. We don't know if he had any other food. We don't know how far he lived. We know they're up a mountain, so it's not probably by a town. But this little boy gave sacrificially. He gave everything that he had to Jesus. And I find it interesting that sometimes we hold back something when God asks for it. And maybe it's bigger than 5 loaves and 2 fishes. But this little boy gave willingly of 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And you know what? At the end, the disciples, Jesus says, hey, go gather up all the fragments. And you know, they gathered up all the fragments, and it says in verse number 13, it says this, therefore they gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. Now, we don't know what happened with the barley loaves. I always imagine the little boy went home with 12 baskets of barley loaves, and his mom was like, whoa, what happened? Where'd you get all those? But we don't know. But I find it interesting because that little boy sacrificed without reservation, without hesitation. He didn't say no. He just said yes and gave his lunch, his supper, his breakfast, whatever it was, to Jesus to be used. Letter B, let's go back to the Old Testament. I want to talk about, everybody knows who Moses is. You know, his mom had him. She put him in an ark. But I want to talk about Pharaoh's daughter, or the Egyptian princess. Let's look in Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. I find it interesting. There was an old farmer, and his pastor was telling him about how we should give to the Lord of what we earn. And the farmer says, or the pastor says to the farmer, he's like, if you had 2,000 horses, would you give half of them to the Lord? He's like, yeah, I'd give them to the Lord. He said, if you had 500 sheep, would you give half of them to the Lord? He's like, yeah, I would. He says, if you had 1,500 donkeys, would you give them to the Lord? He's like, yes, sir, I would. He's like, if you had 2 pigs, would you give them to the Lord? He's like, preacher, don't do that. You know I have 2 pigs. He was willing to give when it didn't hurt him. There's another story of a guy, and they were trying to get this building built, and the pastor was like, everyone who stands up, anyone that stands up, well, please, come on, we need 1,000. I know it'll be sacrificial, 1,000. And well, at that time, they'd lost their piano player, so they brought in a new piano player, and at that moment, she started playing the Star-Spangled Banner. And everyone rose, and everyone sacrificed, and the commitment was made, and she was kept on as the full-time piano player. All righty, Exodus chapter 2 and verse 5. Exodus chapter 2 and verse 5 says this, and the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the babe, and behold, the babe wept. And she said, and she had compassion on him, and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then said his sister, to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call thee a nurse of the Hebrew woman, that she may nurse the child for thee? You're like, well, how did the Egyptian princess, how did Pharaoh's daughter sacrifice? Well, chapter 1 and verse number 16 says this, and he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew woman and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. Well, unlike our leaders today, well, at least most leaders, Egyptians, pharaohs considered them to be gods, and to disobey them meant punishment or meant death. Pharaoh's daughter didn't know. She's probably a pagan. And my wife, I know, taught the I think the young ladies this in a thing, and yes, I sort of stole her idea from her. Thank you. But I find it interesting that a pagan princess saved God's chosen man that ultimately saved the children of Israel out of Egypt. And we know God orchestrated this, but she had no idea what was going to happen. She saved a Hebrew child. And I'm sure if her dad would have found out that that was the same Hebrew child that would bother them, 40, 80 years down the road, he probably would have hunted him down. But she could have been killed. He said, I want every single Hebrew male killed. But she saved him. I don't know about you, but babies are loud. It's hard to keep babies quiet. Not sure how they kept him, Hebrews and Egyptians, I'm sure they looked a little different. But she willingly said, hey, I'm going to raise this baby. I have compassion on it. She's not named. We don't even know if she believed in God. We have no idea. But she saved someone that would ultimately save people that were the children of Israel, and that would ultimately save the forefathers and the ancestors of Jesus Christ. Can you imagine? If Moses hadn't been saved and he drowned, or the alligator or the crocodile, I'm sure God would have come up with a different plan, or had a plan, because he's all-knowing. But I think our Bible would have read a little different. Well, we see the publican and the Pharisee. We see how they lived, and we see how they prayed. Number 2, they sacrificed. And number 3, these unknown, unnamed people, they had faith. I don't know about you, but I never heard of this lady until I was studying for this thing. I don't know if any one of you, but does anyone know who Henrietta Lacks is? Not ringing a bell. It's all right. I didn't know who she was. So she's a poor tobacco farmer who hailed from southern Virginia, but moved to Maryland to start a new life with her husband. In January of 1951, she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. At the time, due to Jim Crow laws and the bias and the racism that was rampant throughout the United States, only Johns Hopkins Hospital accepted African American patients. Sadly and tragically, she died 9 months after her diagnosis. She never knew the important role her cells were going to play in medicine. Dr. Gray Otto was provided with a section of her tumor for study and found an unusual quality in her cells that he had never seen in anyone else's cells. While most cells will normally perish in a matter of days, Henrietta's did not. Her cell line later became known as HeLa cells and provided invaluable information and proved invaluable due to their so-called immortal qualities. Jonas Salk later used the cells for his polio vaccine research. HeLa cells have also been used as the basis not for hundreds, not for thousands, but for tens of thousands of medical patents and drugs. Yet Henrietta Lacks never had the chance to learn how her cell changed science forever and has helped save millions of lives across the world. Now you're like, well, what does this have to do with faith? Well, I believe she had faith enough to go to a doctor, and the doctors had enough faith in the science and in the cells. But I find it interesting. She had an impact on history. I had no idea she is. We've probably all taken medicine maybe for something that her cells enabled to be researched. If you've had cancer, they got a lot of research of cancer. And I find it interesting that I didn't know about her. I've never read about her in a history book, but she saved millions of people's lives. She had faith enough to go to a doctor. Those doctors had patience and faith enough to study her cells so that they could save millions of people's lives. And I want to look at someone that maybe is not as unknown, but she is unnamed. I've probably heard this story 3 or 4 times in Sunday school, but it's the woman with the issue of blood. Let's turn to Luke chapter 8. Luke chapter 8 and verse 43. Luke chapter 8 and verse 43. Luke chapter 8. Excuse me. Luke chapter 8 and verse 43 says this. And a woman having an issue of blood 12 years, which had spent all her living upon physicians, neither could be healed of any, came behind him, this is talking about Jesus, and touched the border of his garment, and immediately her issue of blood stanched, or stopped. And Jesus said, Who touched me? When all denied, Peter said, They that were with him said, Master, the multitude thronged thee and pressed thee, and sayest thou, Who touched me? And Jesus said, Somebody hath touched me, for I perceive that virtue is gone out of me. And when the woman saw that she was not hid, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared unto him before all the people for what cause she had touched him, and how she was healed immediately. And he said unto her, Daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace. Now I find this interesting. This woman had enough faith that she had faith that if she just touched Jesus' garment, the hem of his cloak, that she'd be healed. And I believe this is how as Christians we can take this and maybe, Jesus isn't on the earth, so we can't go touch his cloak and be healed. That would be pretty amazing if we just go touch somebody's cloak and be healed of whatever ailment we had. But I think we can take, this one was trying to stay under the radar, stay in the background, just be a help. And she got brought into the limelight by Jesus. And he wasn't trying to make it awkward, but he was trying to say, hey, you had faith, you've been rewarded because you had faith, and you're healed now. I don't know about you, but if I had a sickness for 12 years and I'd spent all my money, I'd be pretty hopeless, pretty faithless. I don't even know if I'd leave my house. But this lady had enough faith, enough hope, and tried to stay where she didn't. She didn't come up to Jesus and approach him in a crowd and beg him in front of everyone to heal her. She didn't, ask him to come to her house. She sought him out quietly. She was not even trying to catch his attention. She just knew that if I can touch the cloak, I'll be healed. And I believe that's how we should live as Christians. We're not seeking everyone's praise. We're not seeking when we do ministry or we do something to help someone that people or publish our name in the newspaper. We're just doing it so that we can help others. And for this lady, it made her life change. For 12 years she'd had this. So we see that number one, they prayed. Number two, they sacrificed. Number three, they had faith. And lastly, number four, they served. Number four, they served. Number four, they served. We find people that have served. Like I mentioned before, there's people that serve this church every single day that, clean, that make bulletins, that design the slideshows that go on for the presentations for the thing. And we don't necessarily know who they are every week. But God does, and God's appreciative of them. And we don't know these people who served God and let God use different things. But in Matthew 26:17, if we want to turn there's a man who let Jesus and his disciples use his house for a Passover supper. Let's turn to Matthew 26, Matthew chapter 26. Matthew 26, verse 17 says this. Now the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? And he said, Go into the city to such a man, and say unto him, The Master saith, My time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at thy house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had appointed them, and they made ready the Passover. Now when the evening was come, he sat down with the 12. We don't know who this man was. I think he was at least a decently wealthy man. He had a house that had 2 stories. This is the upper room where they had the Passover. And his disciples just came to this man and said, Hey, Jesus said his time is ready. We're going to use your room, your house. I don't know if 12 strangers came to my house and said, Hey, this guy said we're going to use your house for supper tonight. I'd be like, who are you? You can stay outside. I'm going to call the sheriff's office or something. I wouldn't just let them come into my house. Now, I realize maybe this is a different culture. The Middle Eastern culture, they are more different than the Western. But still, this man, there's no comment of him saying, well, maybe let me think about it. They just use it. And he served God in that manner. And then letter B, we see the woman who washed Jesus' feet. In Luke chapter 7, let's turn to Luke chapter 7. And now, no, let me catch my thoughts. But the one who washed Jesus' feet. This may be the same person in another passage that talks about Mary came and washed her feet. But even if she is named, the point I want to take is when we get into it, and I'll explain it a little bit later. In Luke chapter 7, it says this. In verse 36, it says this. What manner of saying is this that ye I'm in John chapter 7. That's a really good verse, but not the verse I need. Chapter 7, verse 36 says this. And one of the Pharisees desired him that he would eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment, and stood at his feet, behold him weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with his anointment. Now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, he spake within himself, saying, This man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that toucheth him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answered, said unto him, Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee. And he said, Master, say on. You know, interesting enough, we read later down, when the guest came into your house, you were supposed to have your servants wash your feet. Simon didn't do that. He didn't do anything as a host that he's supposed to do. This woman, maybe it is Mary. I'm not exactly sure. But she came in with some ointment, an alabaster box of ointment, which is super expensive. She washed Jesus' feet with. She cried on him. And then she took her hair and wiped someone's feet. I don't know about you, but feet are just gross things. Ask my wife, feet are disgusting, you know. And then she kissed him, so that's even grosser. I mean, can you imagine? Sorry, they walked in sandals, and some of them walked bare feet through, dust-filled, tons of, just nasty stuff on the streets. But she sacrificially did it. She served. She didn't care what she was doing. She put herself in a humble position. And I find the Pharisee, I think he was trying to get a little, inside angle with Jesus. Like, I invited Jesus, the great prophet, over. Look at me. But God turns it around on him and says, hey, you didn't do anything for me. This woman, who cares if she's a sinner? Who cares if she's messed up? She came and she served me. She didn't try to bring attention to herself. She just served God. You know, in verse 45 says this, Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman since the time I came in hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins which are many are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. And he saith unto her, Thy sins are forgiven. And they that sat at me with him began to say within themselves, Who is this that forgiveth sins also? And he said to the woman, Thy faith hath saved thee. Go in peace. I find it interesting that this woman wasn't here to get accolades. She wasn't here to receive praise. But ultimately, she received a greater reward. She received salvation. And Simon, as far as we know, he's burning in hell because he didn't love Jesus. He didn't even take the smallest thing to serve. Now you may be thinking, well, I serve and I do stuff and, I'm unknown. I do stuff and nobody knows about it. Well, I'm sure in 50, 60, 70, 80 years when they're writing history books and if God hasn't come back down and hasn't, ended this world and brought us up to heaven, I don't think the name Wesley Woodard, or Jim Casey or Anthony Trujillo or Amy Trujillo or any of the Trujillos, sitting here, and I'm not trying to be unkind. I don't think we're going to be in a history book. I don't think we are. We might be in, the yellow book pages if they still do that. I don't know. I remember as kids dropping those off. But I don't think I'm going to be in a history book. I don't think I'm going to have my picture, next to a little bio that says Wesley Woodard lived in Cathy's Valley. I don't think it's going to be there. 100 years from now, I doubt anybody's going to remember our name. But know who's going to remember our name? Jesus Christ. They're written down in the book of life, he says. And I find that important that, sometimes you're like, I want to be like David, or I want to be like Joshua, or I want to be like Moses. Well, that's good. We strive to live our lives, to honor God and to be faithful to God. But I want to know if it wouldn't be better to show up, unnamed in God's book than remembered in the world's history book. You know, we all know who LeBron James is. Most people, even if they never played basketball, I never watched a game in my life, but reportedly he was the GOAT, the greatest of all time. You know, he was the best of the best. But you know, unless LeBron James was saved, people are going to forget about him in history. God probably does. He's not written in the book of life if he's not saved. You know, we may not be remembered by anybody except for God. And I hope that's encouragement because, you know, sometimes it seems like no matter what we do, it seems like it's not worth anything. But these people in the Bible, you know, they're not even named. And we don't know why God didn't name them. There's no reason. I mean, or why they're not named, or the writers didn't take the time to name them. But we know they had names somewhere, and hopefully they're written in the book of life. But if God found it important enough to mention the stories of unnamed people in the Bible, I believe if we do our part, we'll be mentioned in even a better book, the book of life. And I hope that's a blessing because it was an encouragement to me that, hey, even if we go unrecognized maybe for our achievements and what we've done in this life, we'll not be forgotten in God's book. So I'll give it back over to Pastor, and thank you so much for the opportunity.